You want to know when poets used to rule the world?
Yes, I do.
This is a much shorter story. And reading one of my favorite anthropologists, who's also a psychologist, a mountain climber, a mountain guide, an ecologist, an environmentalist, and a psychologist. This woman, she just passed away a few years ago, but she is extraordinary, and she writes in her, what I call her magnum opus. I don't know if she'd be comfortable with those words, but her magnum opus, in my humble opinion, was a book entitled Sacred Land, Sacred Sex, Rapture of the Deep. And it's about everything. You name it, everything's in there, and the kitchen sink. Anyway, at one point in this book, she talked about when poets ruled the world. Okay, back at a time when Plato and Aristotle and Socrates were just becoming people of stature and prominence in ancient Greece, the system of law and judges and courts and how society was organized, the scholars and teachers and educators and all those kind of things, were bard poets. A lot of people think of bard poets as a circus act or silly poets or something like that. But bard poets were the be-all and end-all of social organization and the operating principles of how society functions. And what happened is that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, but mostly Plato, took one look at that and said, this is ridiculous, because it's an egalitarian society. It's a society open to all. It's a society where the law is for all people, and a truly egalitarian structure. And Plato said, oh no, we can't have any of that. We can only have a kind of world where the elites, a very tiny number of elites, run the show, and everybody else is lesser minions, the unwashed, the masses. And so what Plato did is, first of all, he started making shifts and changes to the Greek language. So only these elites could understand the language and readily use it for configuring society. And all those lesser minions and the great unwashed wouldn't be able to understand it. Now, in the time of the bard poets, the language was for all. Everyone could use it, understand it, read, write, what have you. But Plato changed all that. So he created a structure of elites, and then there's a long story that goes along with that about everything that he did do in talking to the governing bodies of the day and the large business elites of the day, and how we structured things and how we got away with it. So at one time, poets ruled the world in a really good way, and then Plato came along and really screwed things up. And
well, I'm thinking, how would they get news those days? A fellow would travel around and he'd say, I saw this, and he'd make a poem about it. He'd go to the next place and tell them the poem.
Yeah, it wasn't like CNN and television and radio. No internet, no telephones. So yeah, how would you know how things, what was happening, you know? But so Plato just, wanted to own and control all of that too, as far as whatever the local media was. But of course, in the cities, in the city-states of the time in Greece, he held sway, he had the connections, and then he destroyed the whole bard poet structure to society. And
we always think of Plato as such a forward-thinking kind of person.
Yeah, he's kind of worshipped in the university system. I think the very first person right in the door, a freshly scrubbed freshman, freshly scrubbed first-year person in the doors of a university or college.
Right in the face with Plato.
It's Plato right off the bat. He is the patriarch, the father of modern Western civilization, and if anything, he's destroyed Western civilization before he even got going. And Dolores LaChapelle, who said in her book, Sacred Land, Sacred Sex, Rapture of the Deep, writes eloquently about this. And she talks about quite a few other things that you just don't get in everyday courses in university. That I think the university education is skewed a little bit to be more Platonic than it should be. And in her book, very, very early on, this magnum opus that I talked about, she calls this, when she talks about the bard poets and that, she calls it the Greek language problem, which I always was intrigued by, the Greek language problem, how she made language inaccessible to everyday common man and woman, and only accessible to the elites. But
it's almost like they cut the society in two. There were those who were in one boat and those in another boat.
But the people in the one boat, the elites, were very, very few in number. Most of society was in the Titanic. The
I'm
boat that was sinking.
surprised that they could control everything if there were so many people were not in their boat?
Well, education and language, and like you're saying about media, who would know what's going on in different places? Things were very different then, because like now, there's what's happened in the last few years is and things that I've taken place in, which are quite incredible, is internet revolutions. And one of the early internet revolutions, at least in North America, was the Battle of Seattle. In November, December 1999, there was this unbelievable outpouring of people protesting in the streets of Seattle, and a lot of the communicating was done on the internet. And then people would mass in various squares and centers of Seattle. And then following upon that, 6 months later, I didn't take part in the Battle of Seattle, but I did very much take part in Washington, D.C. World Bank protest. And that protest was all the people who missed Seattle made it, from all over the world this is, from all over the planet, made it their duty, their obligation to make it to the World Bank protest in April 2000. And I was very active and very much involved in that. And I kind of talked my way into the head office too, which is another story. Yeah, but I know that, and I did all kinds of things. Talking my way into the head office, by the way, I want to make it clear, I did a lot of toilet cleaning and fixing broken toilets. So just because I talked my way into the head office, that doesn't mean I wasn't doing those kinds of tasks. I did a lot of writing for the top management, the top bananas, and I did a million and one other things, which you have to do when you have a protest with 100,000 people show up. And not much sleep and not much eating. But my point was just that back at the time of the Bard poets, there were no computers and the internet and that sort of thing. So I think Plato had a pretty easy time just making connections and flexing a little muscle with the people he was connected with in the top echelons of business and government, that kind of thing. And then, to hold sway over the common man and woman was probably a lot easier than it is today. Because anything like that would happen today, people would get on the phone or the internet.
Oh, do you see what Plato's up to?
That Plato guy, man.
Let's get him.
He's well, you look at George Bush,
Yeah.
The American presidency used to have a lot of prestige, and what the American president wants, the American president gets. But now, since George Bush...
He's here to serve us, we're going to make sure he does.
Now everybody has pretty much seen, the costuming and the mask has slipped from his face.
Like the average person today, they're really aware of a lot more things than when I was a young person. People, they went to work, they watched the news, what little bit of it there was, and that's all they knew.
Yeah, and that's changed too, just in the last few years. That to work, eat, sleep, come home, go to sleep in front of the tube while you're watching the 11 o'clock news or whatever, and the 11 o'clock news is quite sanitized. The news organizations basically serve the rich. That still happens, but there's a lot more criticism out there. Don't be serving the rich quite so much. There's also us, the rest of us, out there. But yeah, the people. There just wasn't the culture of questioning, the culture of protest, the culture of discussing things, and it was almost like a Platonic thing. I'm thinking in the United States and Canada, just in the last 50 years or 40 years, the Platonic thing is the elites will come up with all the answers to all of the problems and all the issues. And don't you worry your pretty little heads about them. This kind of was the subtext message.
Like all the environmental actions that are coming out are not coming from the government, of course. They're coming from the little guy who looks on a TV set or whatever, and something's dying off. We're going to stop this desecration of the land. It comes from the little people.
Yeah, and the little people sometimes takes the shape of someone like me, an older person, and university students and First Nations kids. And why I mention those three groups, like old veteran radical activists like myself, men and women in my age group, sort of university students, and then First Nations kids, is those three groups were very much part of a lot of the demonstrations I've been a part of to save the environment in British Columbia.